Welcome once again to the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to have a great old friend of mine, Jeff Wheeler, is here on the show to talk about writing fantasy. Jeff is one of the most prolific and successful fantasy writers that I know, and I was super excited when he agreed to come on the show. Jeff has a brand new book out. It's called The Druid. It's the first in a new series. Is that right, Jeff?
It's the first of
Sort
the
of
new
a new
series.
series.
It's part of my Muirwood universe. So
Right. It's a new series in an existing universe. Is that fair to say?
yes, that is
Very cool.
fair.
Um, Jeff, how many books is this for you now? What, 80, 90, 100
Well, we're in the 30s,
in the
so
30s?
close.
Yeah.
But every time I get asked, I don't keep track. I have to kind
Yeah.
of like look at the bookshelf and like count. But I know we're past 30, and that's kind of it's more than I ever thought I'd be doing in my career. And I still have more ideas, so this is good.
More ideas is always the right answer. That's the answer that you want to have anyway.
Yep, I just hope I live long enough to be able to write down all the stories that are
I
jumbling around in my
know.
head. So,
That has been the answer that I've gotten more than not is that once you get your writing career started, then you start realizing it's kind of like collecting books. Like I'll there comes a point when you realize I'll never have enough years in my life to read all the books that I've collected. It's kind of that way with stories in your
or
head.
download it on my Kindle. That's like
Or
every time
down
I download another one, I'm like, yeah, am I ever going to get to that one? But
I
yeah, I think we
know.
all can relate to that.
And Kindle Unlimited, what a blessing it has been for book lovers, and what a curse it is in the same. Because I've flipped through my Kindle and go, oh my gosh, I downloaded that 3 years ago. I've never opened it. You're like, oh, am I horrible, or am I obsessed? Maybe some of each.
Well, I
Um,
have a lot of my readers thank me for having like all of my titles are on Kindle Unlimited because it saves them so much money. It's like
right,
30 books times, it's like, oh, as long as you can read fast, you can
right,
that subscription like pays for itself
yes.
if you keep at it. So it's a good deal.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because Kindle Unlimited has gone through a bit of a change in the last couple of years, in that now we're including audiobooks in for a lot of titles, and they're not all titles, but a lot of titles. I think some of yours, The Druid, is even it's Kindle Unlimited, and if you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, you can
You
listen
get
to the
the
audio.
audio as well. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
great deal.
it is a great deal. Since your books are translated into audio right off the bat, and are part of this deal where you can listen, that's a big draw for a lot of readers. Um, with that being the fact of publishing right now, does that factor into your writing at all, knowing that one of the main forms of distribution for your book is going to be an audio? Does that affect your writing at all, knowing that the audiobook is going to be probably very popular for your readers?
It's a really interesting question, and it does, but maybe not in the way you might think.
Okay.
Um, so I work with an amazing narrator who's narrated most of my books. Her name's Kate
Right.
Rudd, and the amount of downloads, because I working with Amazon Publishing, I get to see behind the curtain, right?
Right.
I know my sales weekly, daily, monthly, right? And so I can see the change in percentage of how many more people are listening to them now. But the way it changes it, when I'm actually writing the book, I'm writing it knowing that Kate is going to be narrating it. And so I will throw in things just for her because she acts the roles of the characters. And
Right.
so if I want her to use an inflection in her voice, I'll write it into the manuscript because she picks up on those cues. And then when she performs the character, she will include the emotion or whatever I'm trying to get at in the dialogue. So knowing that a narrator is going to be narrating actually influences the way I write because I might not do it a certain way, but knowing it, I end up adding those little things in there because when I listen to the book later and I hear those, it's like, yeah, I did that on purpose.
I love that because I've asked that question to some people before, and they're like, no, I don't factor audiobooks in at all. That's, that's not even a thing I think about. And I love that you do think about that, and that factors into the way that you write things. That's so much fun. That adds another layer, to the stories. That's great. um Jeff, what was your introduction to fantasy? You are knee deep in fantasy writing now, but what was it that got you as a fan into fantasy?
There's two answers. There's two books that kind of was my springboard, because I tried fantasy in elementary school. Um, I had tried to get into it, but it was the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd
Yes.
Alexander. And so I remember a fellow student gave a book report on the Book of Three, which is the first book in that series. And he made it sound so interesting. And then I tried reading it, but I was like in fourth grade, and I wasn't a really great reader back then.
Yeah.
But just his enthusiasm made it a little bit infectious to me. So I ended up reading that whole series, loved it. And then I started dabbling with other fantasy books. Like I couldn't get into Lord of the Rings. Read The Hobbit, I think, didn't really like it. Read Chronicles of Narnia. But it wasn't until junior high that I found Terry Brooks. And I was just going through the fantasy shelf at my junior high library, and I happened to grab one of the Shanner books. Wasn't even the first one.
Oh, wow.
Grabbed it off the shelf, started reading it, thought I've got this whole thing figured out. And then by chapter 3, he'd blown up all of my theories to dust. And it's funny because just this week, summer vacation, my kids, we have kind of reading goals for them. It's like, hey, you got to read before you play electronics. And so my youngest son is a voracious reader, and he's like, I'm throwing out suggestions to him, and he's like, read it twice, and I'm like, Terry Brooks. He's like, no, I haven't. So I pulled a copy of Sword of Shannara off the shelf, place it in front of him. I'm like, okay, read it. I'm like, I don't know if he's going to like it, because back then there's a lot of maybe info dumping at the beginning. And I thought, is he going to get, bored because of all these monologues that are happening?
Right.
But after that afternoon, I looked back, he was already on page 110. He'd blown past that. I'm like, oh, this is good. So it's really weird that he's the age I was when I started reading Terry Brooks. And it's just, It was kind of this full circle moment. But it was Terry that made me think, not only do I love fantasy, but I want to be able to write this someday.
Right. I had a very similar experience, that I was exposed to Terry Brooks kind of early on. And then in later years, getting to know Terry Brooks and getting to talk with him. What a sweet guy. I mean, just salt of the earth, just exactly who you wanted him to be. And they say don't meet your heroes, but Terry is one of those guys that definitely holds up with what you think about him.
No, he's been a mentor of mine. I've taken writing classes from him. He even did a blurb for one of my books.
Oh, how cool.
And that was like, I was too embarrassed to ask him. So I asked my editor to ask him. He said yes. And he gave me just the nicest blurb for my book, Knight's Ransom. And I just made my day. And I've been to Comic-Con with him, been on panels with him. And I'm like, I shouldn't be here with him. He's like, he's a wizened guy who's been this forever. But he is truly a gracious, wonderful man. So
yeah. Well, speaking of the differences in fantasy, from almost 50 years ago when the Sword of Shannara was published, 40 something thereabouts. I would consider you a modern fantasy writer. You've published all of your books in the last 15 years for sure, right?
Yeah.
And compared that with like the Sword of Shannara, where you're absolutely right. And I've talked with Terry about this. You go 75 pages and nothing really happens. There's a lot of exposition, like you said, a lot of world building. It's immersive for sure, but there's not a great inciting incident right up front. Whereas nowadays, when you're telling an adventure story for sure, or fantasy, you kind of need to give readers something pretty close to upfront to grab their attention and to hurl them into your world. How do you feel about the way fantasy is now versus then? And is it are there things that you think about, when you're beginning a book? I need to have this happen. How do you start thinking about kicking off a book and getting people immersed in your story and then your world?
That's an awesome question. And what was acceptable or the norm for fantasy or literature in general,
Right.
40 years ago is different than now. You do have to be able to throw people into the story. I grew up probably like you with Star Wars, and I still
Yes.
remember sitting in the movie theater when I was a little kid, watching a Star Destroyer fly overhead where they threw you into the action.
Right.
And I've always loved adventure stories like that, whether it's science fiction or fantasy. And so for my books, I do spend time thinking about what, especially that first chapter. It's like, where in the story are we going to start? Is this going to be a flashback scene? Is this going to be the middle of it? I really try to come up with that introductory scene that's going to hook the reader in as soon as possible. So although I write fantasies, part of me what I write is thrillers too, right? You really want to try to keep a fast pace. I don't, I've had some readers say like, you should write an 800-page epic fantasy. I can't do that. That's not the way my mind works. That's not the way my stories come. They tend to be more fast paced and pull you in real quick. And I will do time jumps in between books so that I don't have to have all these extra chapters that are slowing things down. Because
Right.
I really want my readers to be able to just keep turning the pages and hardly be able to put the book down. And I think that's more expected today.
Yeah.
And maybe we didn't have as many distractions back then. There weren't as many, weren't as many cool movies, weren't as many exciting video games, weren't as many things that are able to hook a teenager's attention. That when you had hours to kill, why not read a book? Now books are competing with other forms of entertainment, and so
Right.
I just want to make sure I write a kind of book that readers of all ages are going to be able to grasp and hang on to. Which means you got to get to the action pretty quick.
Right. Jeff, you have one of the most awesome publishing stories. You began as an indie author, then was courted by Amazon Publishing, and now you publish a good many of your books with Amazon as your publisher, but they tend to run sort of a hybrid house. It's a lot of the benefits of self-publishing while having the monstrous power of Amazon behind you for marketing and all of that. What got you into writing first off? What was that first story that you had to write?
My first stories I actually wrote in high school, and they weren't fantasy at all. They were probably, I would categorize them as either historical thrillers or political thrillers. And for me, it was just sinking my teeth into. I was into comic books back then. And I wanted to write stories that would get me excited and make an audience excited. So that's how I began. It wasn't until college that I had decided to switch to fantasy, and the reason was, with a fantasy world you can make stuff up. Like I found with my historical things, like I was doing so much research to make sure it was accurate. But with fantasy, you have a lot of leeway to not be constrained by what actually happened in history. So that's kind of, to me, I've always been a storyteller. Like I used to sit at my grandpa's backyard in Utah with my cousins, and I would tell stories like for hours sometimes. So telling stories has been part of my DNA for a long, long time. And I just found that writing was that vehicle. So in high school, like my siblings would be watching cartoons, I'd be up in my room on a computer typing up chapters of a story, and I wrote like 5 novels while I was in high school.
Wow. So what was the first story that broke you into publishing?
Self-publishing or with Amazon?
The first thing that you published as an indie author.
So I actually published a children's story, hardcover children's story, like back in 1999. Like That was before self-publishing was a pretty big deal. There weren't a lot of tools. I had to hire an artist, editors, fund it all myself. It sold horribly. I still have a box of copies in my garage that never sold, because what I realized is while I could produce a book, I couldn't produce the infrastructure of the publishing industry, right? The storage and the distribution and the connections with bookstores and all those things. And so I tried that, didn't work. And I realized, okay, I need to kind of build an audience. And so I actually created a magazine with some friends called Deep Magic, where we would publish people's short stories, including mine, because I thought, hey, let me create this free magazine, electronic magazine, to be able to find readers. And that worked pretty good. And then I used that as a vehicle to launch my first 2 fantasy books. But again, this was before social media was around. People would have to find us, hear about it word of mouth. And it took a lot of time to create this. And so we ended up shutting it down because it took up so much time. I wasn't writing books. And so it was literally, years of doing that before I said, let me try the traditional route. And so I wrote the first Muirwood series, tried to get an agent, got turned down 40 sometimes, and then was like, okay, the traditional path, the door's closed. Maybe I go and try self-publishing again. I've got an audience, a little bit of an audience. I fostered through Deep Magic. And then I started that approach. And now social media was there to be able to help people share things. And that's when things started to move a little bit. And it was that self-publishing effort that is what put me on the radar screen in Amazon Publishing, because they had just created their own publishing companies. And they did like thrillers and mysteries and romance, and they finally got around to my favorite, fantasy. And they said, well, who are some of the self-publishing, fantasy authors out there? Maybe we can recruit some of them to come in. So they reached out literally to me about 10 years ago. And it's like, it just amazes me 10 years later. It's like 10 years ago this month, I signed my publishing contract with Amazon Publishing, and had no idea the adventure that was awaiting for me the last 10 years.
Would you say that the Kindle revolution was part of the sea change that happened? From publishing that book in '99, where you had no infrastructure, you had to build everything to get anything accomplished, from the writing to the assembling to the publishing to the marketing. All of that was squarely on your shoulders. Did the advent of the Kindle, and then Amazon kind of getting behind that and building this infrastructure where people could come and, having a platform where people could upload their books and then sell those. And then you had the perfect delivery mechanism with the Kindle, and then, the ability to load the Kindle app onto iPads and iPhones and Android phones. And was that kind of the thing that turned the tide in publishing?
It absolutely did. And it's kind of like when the US government decided to build freeways all over the United States. You put in the infrastructure, and then it allowed the businesses to be able to be created. So I was definitely part of that. The Kindle at first was helpful, but it wasn't the only platform that was there at the time. And so people would use a company called Smashwords to be able to get your digital content on across many of the different things. For me, it was KDP, right? So not only was the Kindle available, but the KDP infrastructure, the Kindle Direct Publishing, that allowed it. And it was brand new. And the other thing I think that was a phenomenon back then, that really started, like binge, people were binge watching, like, television shows, series, like people weren't happy waiting a week for the next episode to drop. And then suddenly you could start getting, you could like binge an entire season, and they started doing that with books too. So for me, the fact that when I self-published Muirwood, I published all 3 books at the same time and put it out on the Kindle platform. And then through KDP, they allowed you to give away the books for free. And so I said, let me just give away the first book for free.
Yeah.
And I did it right at the time that KDP was allowing that to happen. And because that happened, readers could not only grab the first book, but they could immediately download the second book, finish that one, immediately download the third book. And so I gave the first one away for free, but I made money on books 2 and 3. And then they started telling all their friends. And so suddenly you could grab all 3 books at once. And so I think it was a mix of the trend of binge reading
Yeah.
as well as having the infrastructure available through the Kindle that allowed just sales to happen. That I didn't need to be in every bookstore in the United States. Readers in Israel and England and Australia and other continents were discovering me because they were having friends telling them about it, and that word of mouth just allowed it to happen.
You were utilizing magnets and reader funnels and all of those things before those were buzzwords
Yeah.
and phrases used in publishing. That's awesome. Did, a lot of people would look at that strategy of publishing a whole trilogy at once and recognize that as a strategy that people use now and try to utilize to get buzz going and all of this sort of stuff. Did you have any idea that that was going to create the kind of traction that you eventually got, or did you just happen to have a finished trilogy? Like, was this a plan from the beginning, or you just happened to have what you needed and struck gold, for lack of a better term?
Serendipity, divine
Yeah,
intervention. It's just interesting because I had, after I'd written the first book of the Mirrorwood series, I'd started going to agents, but I didn't stop. I'm like, well, I'm excited to write book 2. Let me start writing book 2. And and so, because the querying process takes a long time, you wait for agents to get back to you, and then you send out the next batch. And I did have one agent that requested the full manuscript, and I really thought, I'm like, this is it. Like, and
yeah.
they wanted the whole thing, a little snippet at first, then send us the first 3 chapters, then send us the whole thing. And I'm like, this is it. And 6 months down the road, I got the rejection letter. And it was
Mm,
like, but I hadn't stopped writing. So I still had books 2 and book 3. And what was kind of my clue for me is my early readers, like my niece and my sister and some family members, they were all asking me, can I share this with my friends? And I'm like, no, I don't want the book going out into the world. I wanted to have control over it. And so I was very selective. Okay, you can share it with this one person. You can share it with this one person. And it was everybody I shared it with kept wanting to share it with somebody else. And that kind of gave me the confidence as a writer to be like,
yeah.
wow, I'm not asking people to read it. They're asking me. And then a friend of mine from high school through Facebook reached out to me and said, hey, Jeff, I've been following your publishing journey. Can I read, your book? I just haven't, it's not published. It's not out in the world. I just would love to read it and see what's going on. So I sent her a copy of it. And 2 days later, she's like, can I have book 2? And it's like, sure. Send her book 2. One day later, she's like, where's book 3? I'm like, I'm not done writing it yet. She's like, well, hurry up and get that third book written. So
Oh my goodness.
I hadn't, I hadn't stopped writing. And so that by the time the agent thing had the doors had closed there, and then Kindle was starting to come and the KDP was starting, I happened to have 3 books done. So was that serendipity? The fact that I just hadn't stopped writing as part of the discipline as a writer, it's like, I'm just
Yeah.
always going to write a new chapter every week. And if I do that, I can write a book a year. That's kind of the benchmark I'd given myself. And I just didn't stop. And now instead of writing 1 chapter a week, I write 3 chapters a week. So I can do 3 books a year, at least, maybe 4 some years. And I've just kept that cadence going ever since I left my day job.
Fantastic. I love that story so much. Um, as you mentioned, Amazon spun up their own publishing houses, 47 North, and you've been publishing with them for a while now. What is it like to have the power of Amazon behind you as a publisher? That has to be, you you maintain control of your stuff, yet you have, the big guy on the block helping with everything. That's got to be the best of all worlds.
Well, it is the best of all worlds. It, it is like working with a traditional publisher. Like I don't have final say on my covers. There's lots of even the titles of the books is a negotiation because they're really smart. Like
Yeah.
an idea for a book title, and they're like, Jeff, nobody's going to be able to spell that and type it into the search on Amazon to find it. It's like, yeah, that's true. So they're really smart, and they have a really good marketing team, and they've got great publicists that have gotten traditional book reviewers like Publishers Weekly and Book Lists and review my books. And so it's hybrid, but it's more traditional now. It's a lot harder to get in. You need an agent to get with Amazon Publishing now. It's they're not looking for people the same way they were at the very beginning. So the timing again. Was there, but I wish I could explain, because a lot of it's just confidential. I know the different marketing levers they have to pull.
Sure.
It is so powerful, and every other publisher out there wishes they had that. It's like everybody knows about Kindle Daily Deals and or BookBub, newsletters where you can pay to have this book appear in a newsletter and your sales bump up for a couple of days. Yeah, I get that too, but I get stuff that the rest of the world doesn't get. And I know what it is. I've seen it in action. I can see the results on my dashboard for book sales. But ultimately, the best way to sell a book is word of mouth, right?
Sure.
Write a good book. And because there's authors that they've used their tools on that haven't sold. And so, it's not everything they pick up isn't a guaranteed success. Ultimately, the best books sell, and that's what I've always tried to do, is how do I keep increasing my skills as a writer, and how do I keep attracting new readers to give me a try, and not just do 15 book series. I always try doing new things to invite new people in and see which one they're going to like the best.
Let's talk writing for just a minute, Jeff. So with a series like Muirwood, at one moment in time, nothing about that existed. It didn't exist at all. And then either a character walked onto the stage of your mind and you started wondering, who is this character and what are they up to? Or maybe you thought of an epic plot point and like, oh, this would be fun to put a character through this. And then, you start casting this story in your mind with characters that you make up. Or maybe you have read something that triggered the what if game in your mind. And then at that point, the moment of inspiration, then this book, this whole series does exist. And then it's your job as the writer to kind of excavate those stories and to dig them out of the ground and then polish them up. And then this whole event of creation has happened. What is that first moment of inspiration like for you?
Oh, this is so fun to talk about, because I know the people who are going to be watching and listening to this later are writers like me, and we all have different experiences with it. And you use the metaphor of excavating. The metaphor I like is sculpting, because you get a big block of stone like Michelangelo, making David, and he can see David in the stone, and he's just chipping away to kind of reveal what's there. And and for me, sometimes it's like the book's already written. It's like the future's talking to me. It's like, this book's there. I just have to actually now put words on the page to reveal what's something that already exists in the future. So that's kind of the way I've looked at it. My process, the way I do it, is I don't start writing the book right away. There's a quote from a Roman philosopher named Ovid, and he basically says a new idea is delicate, right? It can be, it's very delicate. You've got to handle it delicately. It can be blown away. In fact, I have a copy of this quote. My publisher gave me this little notebook with my favorite quote on it as a publishing present. So
I love it.
rather than just trying to butcher the quote, let me just read it. It says, "A new idea is delicate. It can be killed by a sneer or a yawn. It can be stabbed to death by a quip and worried to death by a frown on the right man's brow." And when I read that quote from Ovid, who was somebody that inspired Shakespeare, right? Ovid's works inspired Shakespeare, and all of us, like Terry Brooks for me. Terry Brooks was inspired by other author, E.M. Forster. There's other authors that were all inspired by somebody else. But for me, when that new idea comes, I don't try writing it right away. Usually what I do, whether it's a passage in a book, a scene in a movie, a place I visited, a scene from history, wherever that inspiration came from, I'll write it down. I'll send myself a little email, and I've got a special little folder where I put those kinds of emails, and I'll just sit on it. And I'll just let that idea germinate and incubate in my brain for a while. And then I'll when it's time to pick a new series, I'll go through that email folder and I'll go, which one's developed? It's like walking through a greenhouse, and like which plant's been developed, and oh, this one's still very small, and this one's sprouted a couple branches, and I'll kind of wander through the garden and see which one do I feel like tackling next. But I always give it that incubation period, and that incubation period is years. And sometimes it's just months. Sometimes I'm so excited to write it that I'll let it incubate for a couple of months before I go through my process of developing it and building bones around it and coming up with a plot structure and characters and things like that. So sometimes that process is short, sometimes it's very long. But I always go through that process, but I always capture that idea, because when those little flashes of inspiration come, it's like, this could be turned into a book someday. Sometimes it's a nightmare. And I'll wake up and I'm like, that was horrifying. And I'll write it down and I'll send that email to myself. And sometimes even those nightmares can turn into a book.
Fantasy is one of those genres that immediately conjures up imaginations. When you tell someone I'm a fantasy writer, some people will think I write about dragons and and knights that are rescuing princesses, or maybe they'll think Stephen King and some otherworldly creatures, and all of those things can fit under fantasy. And we've got lots and lots of subgenres that have developed over the years. Where would you, if someone had never heard of you or your books, where would you tell them, how would you describe your flavor of fantasy?
Well, I have different flavors. My most predominant would be probably traditionally labeled as epic fantasy, because they take place in a different world that's not this one. Some people think, oh, you're YA, you're young adult, because I have a large YA fan base. I also have a large 80-year-old plus fan base. So that's, again, one of the neat things about being able to see behind the curtain is I know my readership demographics. I know the percentages of male and female. I know the age bracket. And my age bracket is almost uniform across the spectrum.
Wow.
Which is highly unusual, because usually you might hit one group and you might peak in that group. But mine's pretty evenly distributed across. So I get fan mail from a wide range of people. So it can feel YA because I don't have a lot of, I have sex or swearing or like horrible gore in my books, because I want my kids to be able to read my stuff. And so people think maybe you're just YA, but no, I've got my readership is across the spectrum. But epic is there, but I have a series that feels a little steampunk, but the category is actually called Gaslamp. So something that's more of a Regency era, but not requiring technology. It uses magic. And so I didn't even know that existed until my publisher's like, no, this is Gaslamp. I'm like, oh, that's a thing. Okay. So there's all these different categories which are used and are very helpful in the Amazon algorithms to be able to categorize where these books land. So that way readers can find like books to be able to know, okay, maybe if I like this kind of thing, I might like Jeff as well.
Jeff, speaking of magic, how do you determine where to use magic and what the appropriate usage is and the appropriate scenarios where magic can come in? Uh, we know that in a lot of fantasy, magic sort of takes the place of technology in a way, or maybe societies don't evolve in the same way because of magic. But there are also plot ways that plot develops because magic is available, or you may choose to withhold um, some of the things that magic could do. I guess what I'm asking is how do you decide who to give that power to and when?
It's an awesome question, and there's classes people teach. I think Brandon Sanderson has one of them that talks about magic and stuff. And I like to look at it in a pretty simple thing. The story needs to be compelling. And it's not compelling if the magic can solve every problem easily without any weaknesses. So my magic systems always have to have downsides to it. So that way, and that they don't, it doesn't easily come along to solve every problem. It's really about what brings people into stories, especially fantasy, isn't just the magic system. It's the characters, right?
Yeah.
If you didn't have Ron, Harry and Hermione, Hogwarts sounds interesting, but we see it and it becomes interesting because we're experiencing it through the lives of the characters.
Right.
And so I'm much more interested in the character development side, but I need to make sure that, especially since I'm doing fantasy, that there's magic there. And so in each of the different worlds that I've created, I have to come up with what are kind of the rules, who has access to the magic, who can be good at it, who's bad at it, who's not allowed to use it, because that is a great way of increasing tension. In my Muirwood world, if you are an orphan who doesn't know their parents, it's like you're not allowed to mess with the magic. Yet these are I have characters that have affinity for it, and it's like, well, they're not allowed, and then so it's being restricted that adds tension, which is something I'm always trying to do. So in each of the worlds, I do try to come up with what are the powers, what can happen with it, and what are the different pros and cons that exist with it. Similarly to the technology of the time too, because even in a fantasy world, there's technology. It's like, are there clocks? How do they tell time? There's
Right.
How do they travel? How do they get from point A to point B? So understanding the technology in the world is important to understand too. So I have to figure all those elements out before I even start writing the story.
One thing that's been that I've seen, uh, one interesting way to tie magic to character development that I've seen in the past is to have magic come at a cost. Like instead of just having um, people with limitless power who can just pull off anything they want, there has to be a cost that comes with using magic. And I know that like you said earlier, that there's a downside to magic sometimes. When developing a magic system and thinking about the characters that you're going to create, do those things factor in, like what the magic is going to, how it's going to affect people, not only just to get them out of binds or whatever, but what's going to be the fallout of using these powers?
Absolutely, I think of that, and I probably learned that the most from the Terry Brooks school. So that first book of his that I read was called The Elf Stones of Shannara,
Yes.
and the main character has these elf stones that are supremely powerful, except for because he doesn't have a strong elven blood, he struggles to use them, and when he uses them, it hurts. It's like he feels something changing inside of him that doesn't feel good, that feels negative, and that negative reaction becomes a block for him to be able to summon their powers. I love that, right? Because it's not just, hey, he's the hero because he can use the stones to wipe out the bad guys, but then suddenly it's like, oh, I have to use it, or he struggles to use it, and here comes the danger, and they don't work. And I love that about Terry's writing and stuff, that there is that cost that comes in there. And so I definitely come more from that school where where magic the ability of magic might be huge, but its impact on the people who use it comes with either emotional costs or physical costs. It drains them as something that happens that they're like, I'm not sure that this is the right thing, but I absolutely conceive of that as part of my storylines.
Eileen just commented, I just had to write an entire scene about how the bathroom works in my fantasy work. And yeah, that's when you commit to that level, then that can bring depth to your fantasy work. Yeah, that's the finding finding what things to elaborate on in your worlds and what things to just let people gloss over and figure out for themselves. When you start thinking of a new world like Muirwood, for instance, do you start? I guess what I'm. How much do you sketch out the world ahead of time so that when you start writing, kind of the rules of the world and the boundaries of the world, or does it just develop as you write the story?
My process is different now than it was when I first started. I always have tried to center the idea in a period of maybe history that I happen to know something about, or a culture that I happen to know something about. Now I go through a more formal process because I do this for a living, where I really look at all the vectors of politics, religion, geography, economics. I look at all those kind of socioeconomic things to say, okay, how do these things exist? So even in my new book, The Druid, which is kind of a medieval fantasy, it's about the founding of Muirwood Abbey. And the readers of the books who have already read it, it's like, oh, they know the industry that Muirwood Abbey had, because even a medieval abbey had to have an industry in order to be able to be self-sufficient. It wasn't just related to donations from wealthy patrons. And so, I start off with the beginnings of the industry of Muirwood, because I think about that. It's like towns and cities exist for a reason,
right?
Because of they're on a trade route, or because of the geography of being close to water, or I went up to Alaska, and it's like, wow, there's no farm fields out here because it's mostly stone. And so if your climate and your geography, all of these things play a role. So I actually go through a process as part of a world building process, where I think through, like, okay, who's in charge? Who's the political powers? Are they local? Are they from afar? Do they have religions? What's the magic? How does that work? Is there a class hierarchy, that goes into it too? So I go through a process to kind of figure that out. And then often during that process, I'll think of characters that can help reflect those different elements. And so that way it reveals it to the readers. I don't have to just dump all this backstory on them, but they meet characters that maybe represent these different facets, and that's where they learn about these things, is the interaction between these characters.
Well, and I was just about to read this question. You sort of answered it there. And is there a point that is too much world building for the reader? And I would expand on that and say, how do you balance world building with character development? And I think you just talked about that, is using the characters to reflect the reality of the world. That's really what readers are looking for, isn't it? That they can care about the character and learn about the world all in the same passage.
It's true. And I heard that J.K. Rowling knows more than what she's revealed in her books. And I think that's smart of authors to do the same thing, that just because you know something doesn't mean the reader needs to know it. And so you have to kind of parse through what's going to be interesting, right? This is a story. What will be interesting, not just for me, but for the reader who's going to be doing it. I think it was Terry Brooks who gave this metaphor, that it's like we're making sandwiches, and I'm bringing my best ingredients as the author for this sandwich, but I'm not providing all the ingredients. The reader provides ingredients too. The
Right.
reader might be expecting peanut butter and jelly, and I'm bringing turkey and avocado. And so sometimes there's a disconnect. I'm going to bring the best ingredients I can, but it might not be the sandwich you're going to want to eat. And so it's important for me to kind of limit. And by limiting information, you want the reader to be begging you for the next info dump versus saying, whoa, I'm stopping reading because you just dumped the whole dump truck on me in chapter 2. And you just can't get away with that. I just found characters is my way of doing that. And the other trick that I use as an author is I really rely on interchapter quotes. So in almost every book that I've done since my very first self-published, I really did this in Muirwood as a way of solving the problem. Is I use these little quotes before the chapters that will reveal something about the world, but it's in such small little bite-sized things, and those quotes are usually related to the chapter they're about to read.
And so sometimes hints as to what you're going to read.
Exactly. So that way it's like you always know that, so readers don't want to miss these. They don't skip them. It's not like a long epic poem that Tolkien used to do, right? It's like skip the poetry, skip the song, but it's like, oh, these are clues that Jeff's weaving in there. And that became a tool that I've used through most of my books to be able to help feed the reader information that I can't find, there's no, otherwise it'd be an awkward thing where suddenly a character in a pub is like, well, blah, 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 because I need the reader to know this. It's like, well, it seems contrived to me. So I can weave that stuff into my interchapter quotes as a way of providing the information directly to the reader that they're going to need before it gets revealed in the story.
That is a great tool that's a fantastic tool for people to use. Jeff, when you are conceiving of a character for a book or series, do you start thinking about this character's journey in each book or in an overarching series that you want this character to begin at point A, and then by the time we get to the end of the series, we want this character to have progressed to, point, maybe not point Z, but further along the journey? Do you start thinking about the character's journey when you're first conceiving of the book?
Absolutely. In fact, that's the primary consideration for telling the story. I had this idea of a character in a fantasy story, this character, and the trope that I wanted to kind of flip was, it's like they're the chosen one, right? It's like you're the one who's going to defeat the enemy. And in so many books I'd read, they're like, okay, I'll do it. And this character's like, heck no. It's like, I don't want to be the sacrificial lamb. No, thank you. I'm going to run away every time the bad guys show up. I don't want to be part of that. And that appealed to me. And I had this kind of medieval fantasy setting for it. But then I took a trip to China. I was invited to go to China to be part of an author's kind of a symposium thing. And it was super cool experience I had a couple of years ago. And after going to China, I'm like, I could tell this story of this character, but in a kind of medieval Chinese setting instead. And so the setting was totally arbitrary. I could have done it in either way, but it was the character that had inspired me. And then I learned that my niece has a form of synesthesia where she can smell people's emotions. And so, and I didn't even know she could do this until when I was coming up with that. I'm like, oh my gosh, that would be such a fun character attribute because no one could lie to her. They could say anything they want, but she could smell the truth through how horrible it was. So I talked to her to describe what it was like, and I made that part of the magic that she had, where that way she's always running from people because she's like, oh, this is part of the bad guys, team, because she could smell them literally.
Wow.
And I just thought that, and so I ended up creating this trilogy based on that story idea. But it was that character arc of somebody refusing to meet their destiny, and then what would it take to persuade them? How much suffering would they have to see among the people of the world to go, okay, it's even if I have to die, it's worth it because I just can't let all this bad stuff happen to other people. And I just thought, okay, I've got to keep ratcheting it up to the point where she's like, if I'm the only one who can stop this, okay, I'll finally accept it, but running from it at first. And so that journey is that the initial part of what I think of for the story. In fact, all the stories that I do.
That is fantastic. I've got a question from our community, from Loris that I want to pose to you. Loris says, "My main character has a cold, mysterious personality. He doesn't say much and usually avoids engaging with others. How could I get the reader to feel connected with such a character who feels very distant, to make the reader care enough in order to follow my character story?" And let me just tag onto that question from Loris is, one of the biggest challenges for writers is to create very three-dimensional characters, and sometimes that can mean unlikable characters, or at least on the surface seem unlikable because they don't immediately resonate with the reader. But the longer we stay with them, the writer can build things about this character that makes us realize they really are someone I want to root for. How do you go about doing that?
It's a wonderful question
Right.
because you run the risk if you make them so unlikable that people are turned off by them. Some people had a negative reaction to Katniss Everdeen,
Right.
in the Hunger Games and stuff. I didn't have a problem with her, but some people did. They're like, oh, it's like she's good with a bow, but she's a jerk,
Right.
to so many people. Um, the way I would recommend is because in order to mitigate that risk, right? If this is the character that you want to tell the story, you need to be able to help the reader see how they got that way. What happened to them that made them that way? And people will react with empathy when, especially if they see something negative happen to somebody. So I try even in my villains, like in my story, The Queen's Poisoner, my villain is a kind of a Richard III archetype, Shakespeare and
Right.
stuff. But I go into how did he become like that? Where because the more you understand how somebody's emotional journey, the more a reader's going to feel sympathy for how they got there. And so that's what I would do, because it's going to be really hard if that's your point of view character and they're not interacting with others. You're going to be living in their head a lot, and if they're not likable, that means you're going to need to be finding those things that at least maybe they might not be likable, but they're going to relate to, oh man, if I was raised like that, if I had a dad like that, if I had a mom like that, if that happened to me, then I would have been the same way. And then they relate to them, and now they're connected. And you got to establish that right at the beginning,
Right.
because otherwise they're going to be like, yeah, not interested, right? And then they're not going to be able to see that wonderful journey that happens.
I think that book, The Queen's Poisoner, was my entry to your work. Has that been the fact for a lot of readers? It seems like that's a extremely popular book for you. Is that the way a lot of people get into your work?
It's my highest selling book.
That's kind of what I figured.
For sure. So even though Muirwood was the thing that catapulted me in, it was The Queen's Poisoner that has been my highest sales and the one that has attracted the most audience. But it was such a risk. Like, I remember my editor, like, your protagonist is an 8-year-old boy. You can't do that. Let's make him 12. I'm like, no, he's got to be 8. Jeff, no one's going to want to read about an 8-year-old boy. I'm like, they're going to want to read about this one.
But I think it's that risk that you take with that character that makes it so compelling. Because I remember reading it and not being able to put it down. Like, this is the things that you did with these characters in that book is just phenomenal. And sometimes you just need to take a risk like that.
Well, the character Owen from Queen's Poisoner was based on my youngest son.
Oh, wow.
Even some of the details of the character, like a little patch of white in his hair. My son was born with a little patch of white in his hair, and he has anxiety. And so, the whole setup of this little anxious ridden boy being yanked away from his parents because his dad did something foolish and betrayed the king, and now this kid is a hostage and his life is on the line. As a parent, I'm like, I would want to read what happened to this kid. If I was a kid, the kid's the hero of the story, that's great, but he's not going to be smart enough to out trick the king. So I had to bring in the poisoner character as his Obi-Wan, as his mentor, as the one who's going to help him figure out. And so you need, even somebody who can't, you need that combination of talents and abilities to be able to pull it off. And because I took those risks, and when my editor read the first draft of it, he's like, I love this kid. It's like, I am so glad we didn't change it. And we did a couple risk mitigation things. Like I began working with my development editor before I was done with the book. So we split it up into thirds. When I was a third of the way done, I sent it to my dev editor to say, give me feedback. How are we doing? And she's like, this is awesome. Keep going. So then I did the next third. She's like, this is great. Keep going. And she would give me a little advice, to how to amp up the tension even more. But we did that mitigation. So that way it wasn't like this, delivering this manuscript to him, all these months later. And it's like, I'm not going to like this. He had a chance to kind of preview it and see where it was going. It's like, okay. And then they said, we're going all in. And they gave it the royal treatment on cover design and everything. And it sure worked.
It's a gorgeous cover. That's for sure. I'm glad that a lot of people have come to your work through that. The new series that we mentioned when we first started chatting, The Dawning of Muirwood, you bring us back to the world of Muirwood with the book that's out now, The Druid, and then The Hunted comes out early fall, and then The Betrayed will be the third book in that trilogy next February. Where are you taking us in this series?
I wanted to tell the origin story of where Muirwood Abbey came from. I've been a history major, in college. I always loved to be able to, visit old castles and monasteries and things like that. And I kind of had the idea of, I wanted the magic system to be more like from Dungeons and Dragons, like a cleric system, where we're so used to wizards, being able to fireballs and lightning and Gandalf and Harry Potter. I wanted a more religious-based magic for the system, kind of like a cleric and stuff. And so these abbeys are these schools where learners come to learn about how to use this magic that's sentient. And so how they approach the magic, if they want to use it for bad, the magic withdraws from them. And so I had this idea. And so I literally threw my character, who was an orphan raised at one of these abbeys where everyone else is allowed to learn to use the magic but her, right? It's just, I thought that sense of injustice I thought would hook people. It's like readers would empathize with a character who wants to learn how to read but is forbidden to learn how to read. And I thought, oh, they'd be so mad at that, right? And so that was where it started. And I'm like, well, I want to tell the story of how that abbey was founded, how the abbey became a character of the story. So how did it begin? And I dropped these little hints in the original books, and I thought I want to explore it. And what's been really fun about The Druid is I've been able to weave in some of the mythology of many of my worlds into it. I see to show people some of the connections that they didn't already know about. And so it's been such a fun adventure to write, and it already has more reviews in 2.5 months than Queen's Poisoner has after like 7 years. So It's been tremendously received, and it might end up outpacing it someday. So I've been in shock that it's appealed to fans of all of my books and brought in new people too.
Holy cats! I just pulled it up, and this is no lie. When we first started recording, I had the Amazon page for The Druid up, and it was 6,900 and some odd reviews. I just refreshed the page, and it's at 7,035 reviews
It's been like that
in an
every
hour.
day. I've just been like, oh my gosh, it's so cool, but just had no idea it was going to be received so well.
That is amazing. That is amazing. I have The Druid on my Kindle, and I've begun reading it, but I haven't finished it yet. And I think on this long Father's Day weekend, that's what I'm going to be spending my time on.
Sounds
Jeff,
good.
This has been an hour already. It feels like we've been talking 10 minutes. And we always have such great conversations. But thank you for joining me in the Storycraft Cafe today. If people are just discovering you and want to get into all the great stuff that you're up to, where can they find you online?
I have a website, jeff-wheeler.com, where I have different my different worlds explained. So if you want to just explore the worlds without actually having read the book yet, to kind of see what kinds of characters are there. So it's kind of a good place to go. I also have a suggested reading order, because I get that when you have 35 books, like, where do I start? That's my most landed on page, is the suggested reading order page. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well.
Jeff, if someone says this weekend I'm going to grab a Jeff Wheeler book, which book would you tell them to start with, the Druid, or is there a better place to enter into your worlds?
I always recommend The Queen's Poisoner, just because it's been my top selling book. Maybe not for long.
Maybe not for long.
But a lot of new people have found me with the Druid, and it represents, I mean, all these millions of words I've written, learning the craft, learning how to tell a story. It's a great story. So, and the fact that there's other books coming but aren't out yet, you could start there and then start visiting some of the other worlds while you wait for the next one to come out.
Be a pretty great audiobook to listen to while laying by the pool this weekend, that's for sure. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Hank. Good to see you again.